Blue lights flash in your rearview mirror. Your stomach tightens instantly, even if you know you were only going a few miles over the limit. You glance at the dashboard. Hands suddenly feel awkward on the steering wheel. Your brain starts racing through every possible thing you might have done wrong over the last 10 minutes. Then the officer walks up slowly, flashlight aimed across your face instead of at your license plate, watching your hands, your eyes, your breathing, even the way you answer good evening. And here's the strange part most drivers never realize. A huge number of Americans break traffic laws almost every single day without knowing it. Not reckless crimes, not high-speed chases, just small habits, tiny assumptions, ordinary behaviors that seem harmless until they become the exact reason an officer decides to extend a stop, ask more questions, search for inconsistencies, or suddenly shift from casual conversation into investigation mode. Have you ever been pulled over and later realized the stop became more serious because of something small you said or did without thinking? Tell me what happened in the comments, because a lot of people don't realize how quickly ordinary traffic stops can change direction. And later on, I'm going to explain one mistake that causes more drivers to accidentally talk themselves into trouble than almost anything else on the road. Most people think traffic laws are mainly about speeding, drunk driving, or running red lights. But officers are trained to notice patterns, tiny details, technical violations, behavioral clues. That's where things get interesting. Sometimes the law itself is less important than what your behavior during the stop suggests to the officer standing outside your window. One of the most commonly broken driving laws in America is something almost everybody does without hesitation: driving with your phone in your hand. Not texting necessarily, just holding it, looking at GPS, checking a notification at a red light, scrolling for 1 second in traffic. In many states, that alone is enough for a stop now. And here's where drivers misunderstand the situation. They think if the car is stopped, they're safe. But in a lot of states, physically holding the phone while operating the vehicle is the issue itself. Officers know people try to hide this behavior the second they notice patrol lights nearby. That quick downward glance, the sudden toss of the phone onto the passenger seat, the delayed acceleration after a green light. Officers are specifically trained to recognize these tiny reactions. What makes this more dangerous than people realize is that distracted driving laws are often used as gateway stops. An officer might initially stop you for phone use, but once the window comes down, they begin observing everything else. Bloodshot eyes, nervous behavior, the smell of alcohol, delayed responses, conflicting stories between passengers, open containers, warrants, suspended licenses. Suddenly the phone violation becomes irrelevant because the stop evolved into something larger. And drivers make this worse by over-explaining. That's another thing people don't understand. Silence feels uncomfortable during police interactions, so people start filling empty space with unnecessary information. Sorry, officer, I was just checking directions. I wasn't texting. I only looked down for a second. Now the officer has verbal confirmation you were handling the device. People accidentally confess because they feel socially pressured to sound cooperative. That pressure becomes even stronger during repeated questioning. Officers often ask the same thing in slightly different ways because they're testing consistency. Not necessarily because they already know you're lying. They're watching whether your story changes under stress. Where are you headed tonight? Then 2 minutes later, so where did you say you were coming from again? Most drivers don't even notice the repetition, but officers notice hesitation immediately. If your answers shift even slightly, some officers interpret that as nervous deception instead of ordinary human memory. Another law people constantly break involves lane changes, and this one frustrates drivers because it feels overly technical. In many states, failing to signal continuously for the legally required distance before changing lanes is a violation. People flip the signal on while already moving over. Others signal once and immediately cut across traffic. Officers watch this closely because improper lane changes are statistically connected to impaired driving. So when an officer sees drifting, inconsistent signaling, or sudden lane movement late at night, their brain doesn't just think, traffic violation. They start evaluating whether the driver might be intoxicated. This is where tone matters more than most drivers understand. The first 30 seconds of a stop are psychological. Officers are reading your emotional baseline. If you instantly become aggressive, sarcastic, overly defensive, or unusually talkative, it changes the atmosphere immediately. and people accidentally create suspicion through behavior that has nothing to do with guilt. A driver digging frantically through the glove compartment can make an officer nervous because officers are trained to watch hands constantly. Fast movements increase tension, so does turning your body suddenly, so does reaching under seats. That's why experienced drivers move slowly during stops, calmly, deliberately, not because they're admitting authority, but because they understand the psychology happening on both sides of the window. One law drivers violate constantly without realizing it involves obstructed visibility, hanging air fresheners from mirrors, large dashboard decorations, stickers placed incorrectly on windshields, cracked glass extending into visibility zones. A lot of people think officers ignore these violations unless they're looking for excuses to stop somebody. The reality is more complicated. Some officers absolutely do use equipment violations as pretext stops because the law allows them to initiate contact over relatively minor infractions. That creates an uncomfortable truth many people don't like hearing. A tiny technical violation can legally open the door to a much larger encounter. And once the stop begins, people often misunderstand their own rights and obligations. For example, many drivers believe they are required to answer every investigative question during a stop. Usually they are required to provide identification, registration, and proof of insurance. But conversational questioning is different from mandatory compliance. The problem is that asserting silence awkwardly can escalate tension fast if done aggressively. People watch internet videos and suddenly think they should instantly say, "I invoke my Fifth Amendment rights." Technically, you can decline certain questioning, but tone changes outcomes dramatically in roadside interactions. Officers are human beings operating under uncertainty. If your delivery sounds confrontational, the entire atmosphere changes. And there's another reality people rarely discuss honestly. Silence itself sometimes increases suspicion emotionally, even if exercising rights is lawful. That does not mean you should surrender rights automatically. It means roadside interactions involve psychology, perception, officer safety concerns, and legal procedure all happening simultaneously. That's why calmness matters more than rehearsed slogans. One of the biggest hidden violations in America involves following too closely. People think tailgating only matters if there's an accident. But officers use following distance violations constantly because almost everyone does it during heavy traffic. Watch any freeway during rush hour. Cars are stacked dangerously close together. One sudden brake check and the chain reaction begins. Officers pay attention to this because impaired or distracted drivers frequently misjudge stopping distance, and drivers don't realize how much their impatience shows externally. Riding bumpers, sudden lane jumps, aggressive acceleration. Officers interpret these patterns as emotional driving behavior. That emotional behavior changes how the stop unfolds later. Imagine this scenario. You've been weaving through traffic trying to get home after a long shift. Nothing extreme, just impatient. Then you see lights behind you. The officer approaches calmly. Any reason you were following that SUV so closely? Now your adrenaline kicks in. I wasn't that close. The officer already saw it differently. So immediately a subtle conflict begins. Most drivers start defending themselves emotionally instead of strategically. Voice tone sharpens, breathing changes, eye contact becomes forced, and officers notice all of it. Another commonly broken law that surprises drivers involves high beams. People forget to dim them constantly. But there's something interesting here. Officers often observe whether drivers respond appropriately after another vehicle flashes lights at them. Delayed reactions can indicate distraction, fatigue, or impairment. Again, tiny behaviors create larger suspicions. There's also a law many Americans technically violate every single week without realizing it. Failing to move over for emergency vehicles or roadside stops. Some states call it move-over laws. Others structure it differently. But the concept is similar. If emergency vehicles, tow trucks, or law enforcement are stopped on the roadside with flashing lights, drivers are often legally required either to move over a lane if safe or significantly reduce speed. People ignore this constantly because they're distracted or assume slowing slightly is enough. Officers take this personally more than drivers understand. To them, roadside stops are dangerous environments where one distracted driver can kill somebody instantly. So when a vehicle flies past too close, it often triggers an emotional response from officers because they've seen fatal accidents happen exactly that way. And here's something else people rarely think about. Officers remember behavior patterns during stops. Respectful does not mean submissive. Nervous does not mean guilty. But hostile behavior dramatically increases the chance an officer becomes less flexible. That matters during discretionary decisions. Warnings versus citations. Verbal warnings versus written warnings. Simple stops versus prolonged encounters. A surprising number of drivers sabotage themselves because they let pride take control. Then there's the issue of registration and insurance accessibility. People technically comply with the law eventually, but the way they retrieve documents creates unnecessary suspicion. An officer asks for insurance. Now the driver starts digging through piles of receipts, bags, fast food wrappers, unopened mail, random paperwork, moving faster and faster while muttering nervously. The officer's attention shifts immediately to hand movements. What are they reaching for? Why are they panicking? Why won't they slow down? Meanwhile, the driver thinks they're simply searching for paperwork. Experienced officers often watch behavior before they even speak. They observe whether occupants are making sudden movements inside the vehicle after lights activate, people stuffing things under seats, leaning toward the center console, turning around repeatedly, passing items between passengers. That behavior alone can completely change the tone of a stop before the officer ever reaches the window. One of the most misunderstood laws drivers break constantly involves stop signs, specifically rolling stops. People call them California stops, slow rolling through empty intersections without fully stopping. Drivers rationalize this because the intersection looked clear. But legally, many jurisdictions require complete cessation of movement behind the stop line. Wheels stop entirely. Even slight movement can technically qualify as failure to stop. And officers love observing rolling stops near bars late at night because impaired drivers commonly do them unconsciously. This creates another uncomfortable reality. Many traffic laws are enforced selectively because officers prioritize patterns associated with dangerous driving. That's why people sometimes say, "Everybody does that. Why did I get stopped?" Because enforcement often depends on context, timing, behavior, location, traffic conditions, and officer judgment. Now, here's where things become psychologically fascinating. Drivers often believe appearing extremely nervous automatically makes them look guilty, so they try too hard to appear calm. Forced smiling, overly rehearsed speech, excessive politeness, strange laughter. Ironically, unnatural calmness can also appear suspicious, because officers interact with thousands of people and become highly sensitive to behavioral inconsistencies. That doesn't mean officers are mind readers, far from it. Innocent people act nervous all the time. Guilty people sometimes appear relaxed. But officers are constantly building mental narratives from incomplete information, and drivers accidentally feed those narratives. One law people violate constantly without thinking about it involves headlights during rain. Many states legally require headlights anytime windshield wipers are in use. Drivers ignore this every day. What makes this interesting is that officers often use these stops during poor weather conditions where visibility already affects driving safety. And weather changes driver behavior dramatically. People become impatient, distracted, and emotionally reactive faster in rain or traffic stress. Another mistake drivers make is misunderstanding consent during vehicle searches. An officer might ask casually, "You mind if I take a quick look inside?" That wording feels conversational, low pressure, almost friendly. Many people say yes automatically because refusing feels awkward. But here's what drivers don't think about in the moment. Once consent is given, roadside interactions can become much more complicated. Officers may inspect areas you never expected. Small unrelated items suddenly become issues. Prescription bottles, legal knives, unsecured items, alcohol containers left by passengers weeks ago. And if you attempt to withdraw consent later, tension often increases dramatically because the atmosphere already shifted into investigative mode. People also underestimate how much passengers influence traffic stops. Officers observe everybody inside the vehicle, not just the driver. One passenger acting aggressively can escalate the entire stop. One intoxicated friend making jokes can change the officer's perception immediately. One nervous passenger blurting out unnecessary explanations can accidentally contradict the driver's story. Even silence gets interpreted differently depending on context. And here's another thing drivers rarely hear. Officers frequently separate occupants conversationally without physically separating them. They ask the driver one version of events, then casually ask the passenger later, "Where are you guys headed?" The officer is comparing answers constantly. This becomes especially relevant during late-night stops, where officers suspect impaired driving or narcotics activity. One of the most commonly broken laws in America involves expired tags and plate visibility. Dirty plates, tinted covers, frames obscuring state names, burned-out plate lights, tiny violations. But tiny violations create legal reasons for stops. And once again, behavior during the stop matters more than people realize. Some drivers become instantly argumentative because they think the original violation is insignificant. "I got pulled over for that?" What they don't understand is that officers often care more about how the interaction unfolds afterward than about the initial reason itself. Another overlooked law involves using hazard lights improperly while driving. In some states, driving continuously with hazards activated during rain or normal travel conditions is restricted because it can confuse surrounding drivers. People assume hazard lights automatically make them safer, but traffic laws sometimes treat them differently than public assumptions do. This happens constantly with traffic law in general. Public driving habits evolve socially, while legal standards remain technical and specific. And honestly, a lot of drivers learn traffic culture from other drivers instead of from actual statutes. That's dangerous, because everybody does it is meaningless during a stop. Now let's talk about one mistake that quietly causes countless drivers serious problems during roadside encounters. Talking too much after the officer already decided the original violation was minor. This happens constantly. An officer stops somebody for speeding. The officer approaches with no intention beyond maybe issuing a warning. Then the driver starts rambling nervously. "I'm just coming from my cousin's place, but we only had like 2 beers hours ago, and honestly I'm exhausted because I barely slept." The officer's internal assessment changes instantly. Wait, alcohol? Fatigue? Why mention that voluntarily? Drivers accidentally introduce entirely new investigative directions because silence feels psychologically uncomfortable. That's one reason experienced defense attorneys constantly emphasize concise communication. Not hostility, not arrogance, just discipline. Answer what is legally necessary. Avoid volunteering unnecessary details. Because officers are trained conversationalists, they know silence creates pressure. Many people reveal far more than intended, simply trying to appear innocent. Another law Americans break constantly involves pedestrian crosswalks. Drivers roll through crosswalks before checking for pedestrians. Others stop directly on crosswalk markings at lights. In some jurisdictions, failing to yield properly carries surprisingly serious penalties. Officers particularly watch this in urban zones because pedestrian accidents create massive liability and severe injuries. And drivers often fail to realize how aggressive their vehicles appear from outside the car. Inside the vehicle, behavior feels controlled. Outside, it can look intimidating or reckless. There's also something many drivers misunderstand about refusing requests during stops. People imagine interactions as simple constitutional equations. But real roadside encounters involve mood, uncertainty, officer discretion, environmental danger, time pressure, and human emotion. An officer standing inches from traffic at midnight is processing risk differently than somebody watching police videos online from a couch. That doesn't erase legal rights. It just explains why calm communication matters enormously. For example, being asked to step out of the vehicle surprises many drivers who believe officers need special justification. Under federal law, officers generally have broad authority to order drivers out during lawful traffic stops for safety reasons. And this is where people panic unnecessarily. The moment the door opens, many drivers assume arrest is coming, heart racing, voice cracking. Suddenly they start talking excessively again. "What's this about? Am I detained? I didn't do anything." Meanwhile, the officer may simply want clearer visibility, safer positioning, or space away from passing traffic. But fear changes driver behavior dramatically. Another commonly broken law involves improper use of turn lanes and merge zones. Drivers cut solid lines, merge too early, cross painted gore areas near exits, use center lanes improperly. Most people barely think about these actions because they happen during ordinary commuting, but officers notice pattern driving. Repeated technical violations combined together often suggest distraction or impairment. And here's something that makes many drivers uncomfortable. Officers are constantly evaluating baseline behavior versus abnormal behavior. How quickly did you pull over? Did you stop in a safe area? Did you continue driving excessively before stopping? People sometimes think slowly searching for a better spot looks reasonable. Sometimes it does. Sometimes officers interpret it as hesitation, concealment, or possible flight. Communication during those moments matters. Hazard lights activated appropriately, gradual slowing, visible acknowledgement. These small signals affect officer perception before first contact even happens. Then there's one law almost every impatient driver breaks eventually: passing stopped school buses improperly. People underestimate how aggressively this violation is enforced because it involves child safety. Different states structure the rules differently, especially divided highways versus undivided roads. But drivers routinely misunderstand when stopping is mandatory, and officers treat these violations seriously because the potential consequences are catastrophic. What's interesting psychologically is how drivers justify risky behavior afterward. I didn't see the sign. I thought the other lanes were allowed. It happened too fast. Officers hear these explanations constantly. That repetition shapes how skeptical or receptive they become during traffic interactions overall. Another issue drivers rarely think about is how physical behavior inside the car affects perception. Avoiding eye contact completely can appear strange. Staring intensely can also feel confrontational. Sudden laughter under stress can seem suspicious even when it's nervousness. Traffic stops are awkward human encounters loaded with pressure and uncertainty. Tiny behaviors get magnified because both sides are evaluating each other rapidly, and officers are absolutely observing your vehicle interior too. Empty alcohol cans, strong odors, open containers, drug paraphernalia, weapons in plain view. Even legal objects can alter the stop atmosphere significantly, depending on presentation and state law. One major mistake drivers make is assuming politeness guarantees protection from escalation. It doesn't, but hostility almost always increases risk unnecessarily. There's a difference between asserting rights calmly and trying to win the interaction emotionally. Too many people approach traffic stops like arguments to dominate instead of situations to navigate carefully. That mindset creates preventable problems. One of the most violated laws in America today involves distracted driving beyond phones. Eating while driving, applying makeup, watching videos at lights, adjusting navigation systems excessively. Officers notice drifting behavior first, then investigate the cause later. And distraction creates exactly the kind of inconsistent driving patterns officers associate with intoxication. That's why some perfectly sober drivers suddenly find themselves answering uncomfortable questions about drinking. Have you had anything to drink tonight? Drivers become offended immediately. But from the officer's perspective, lane drifting plus delayed reactions plus inconsistent speed patterns triggered the question. Understanding officer perspective does not mean surrendering rights blindly. It means recognizing how roadside encounters evolve psychologically and procedurally in real time. Another law people break constantly is driving too slowly in the passing lane. This creates road rage situations more often than drivers realize. Some states actively enforce left lane usage laws, because slow lane blocking contributes to dangerous passing behavior, and emotional driving spreads quickly. One frustrated driver tailgates, another brakes suddenly, somebody changes lanes aggressively. Within seconds, ordinary traffic becomes volatile. Officers observing these chain reactions often focus on whichever driver appears most emotionally reactive. That emotional reactivity becomes important during the stop too. Drivers breathing heavily, interrupting constantly, clenching steering wheels, speaking over officers, all of that influences the atmosphere whether people realize it or not. And here's something else many Americans misunderstand. Recording police during traffic stops is generally lawful in many situations, but the way people do it often escalates tension unnecessarily. Calm recording is one thing. Aggressively shoving phones toward officers while narrating theatrically is another. Again, roadside reality is messier than internet fantasy. Tone changes outcomes constantly. One final law that drivers break without thinking involves seatbelt requirements for passengers. Drivers sometimes assume adult passengers are individually responsible in every state. Laws vary. In some places, drivers can still face consequences connected to unbelted occupants. And passengers themselves create enormous unpredictability during stops. Anxious whispering, reaching into bags unexpectedly, interrupting officers, arguing from the back seat. Officers immediately divide attention across multiple people, which raises tension levels for everyone involved. That's why experienced drivers often keep stops simple and controlled. Minimal movement, calm tone, clear communication, no sudden gestures, no emotional escalation. Because the truth is, most traffic stops begin as ordinary moments. A missed signal, a rolling stop, a phone glance, following too closely. Tiny mistakes almost everybody makes. But roadside encounters rarely stay only about the original violation. They evolve based on behavior, communication, perception, timing, officer judgment, and the emotional decisions drivers make under pressure. And that's the part people usually don't realize until they're already sitting there on the shoulder of the road at night, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than they expected, hearing the officer pause for a second before asking one more question that suddenly makes the entire stop feel different.